everybody. Welcome to USA Global TV and Radio. And for our returning listeners and people watching who've been part of my shows before, a big welcome back to you. And to anybody who's new today, just to say these Talking Head episodes and the Talking Head community is vastly insightful. And my Talking Heads show is all about what I am qualified to do as a profession, but there are different subjects in the Talking Heads community. And so have a look at our website to see what interests you over and above what I'm presenting today. Because my name is Jenetta Barry. And our show today is about dealing with loss. It can be about family members, pets, friends, jobs, a loved one. In other words, about grief. And so let's begin. And the first thing I wanted to say to you is people tend to think that grief, the label of grief is for those who've lost a loved one or maybe even a pet or somebody or a person or an animal that's close to them. But in actual fact, grief comes in many forms, even down to the way one was living, even moving house, changing relationships, changing jobs. There comes a grieving process attached to change. And we forget that there is a process of dealing with it, that are coping skills that really help you to get through so that it doesn't blindside you when you least expect it. We think, I mean, I came from an era where brushing yourself off and getting up and getting going again with whatever happened was the only way you could deal with these. So I'm essentially going to be talking about grief today in terms of losing a loved one. As some of you know, it's a topic very close to my heart, having lost my 16-year-old daughter to suicide after she and I had an enormous argument. So it's something that I really had to work through on a big scale. But so much of what I'm going to talk about today can be applied to any form of change as well. But essentially, this will be about a loved one. And one of the things that I noticed in my early days is that anybody who was not grieving presumed that anybody going through a grieving process again needed to be fixed. I talk about this often in mental health, where people who are depressed are basically labeled as broken and need to be fixed. And it's the same. It's like that person is in a bad way, and they're grieving. So we need to make them like they were before. And that it's really wrong for them to be in grief, and they need to be either pushed out of it or told to snap out of it. And a lot of people have this time frame. It's been however many months or however long. Now come on, you've got to come back to living life normally. Well, one of the things that happens with change is you change. That's what change is about. And so it's not about getting the person to be normal again. It's about understanding what it is they're going through and how to respond to them to help them from a place of empathy to move forward. And the other thing is to understand that there is value in what they're dealing with in their grieving process, because really it's given a bad name that grief has to be addressed and got rid of. One of my quotes I came through with early on in my journey of deciding that I could not stay in deep grief the way I was for the rest of my life, but I understood that grief would be with me forever in different ways, but how I handled it was the important thing. And for me, it was when I was able to say that grief is a vital tool in our search for meaning after loss. And it's been a quote I wrote as I say early on, I've used it lots because actually grieving is absolutely vital in being able to move forward. Where it isn't helpful is when we get stuck in the grieving as being the only way to be, and feeling that we're separated from the rest of the world who isn't grieving. And then we feel as though we're different, we're isolated, we're alone, we're judged. And that it's like a prison sentence, that you're stuck there for the rest of your life with the label of whatever it is that you've lost, and nobody understands you and can empathize with you. So it is a two-way street in dealing with grief, so that it becomes your tool and helps you to move forward into a new version of yourself after great loss. So that's the first thing I wanted to share with you today. The other thing that I have noticed that really helps with people is to understand that when you lose a loved one, it feels like the person you knew, or the animal you knew, or the being you knew, has completely gone. And that's where a lot of the missing comes in. Also, a lot of the guilt and almost the shame, the what ifs, if onlys, or I should have, or I could have, or I ought to have had, all those judgment statements, that adds to the guilt and compounds it. And so there's a whole process of dealing with that. The first one is to remember that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only, it completes its form and its cycle in one form, and because it cannot be created or destroyed, it reforms into a new version of itself. So the very first thing that I started looking for was, well, my daughter was full of energy, so where's she gone? Where's that energy gone? It might not be a she, but where's that energy? And when you've lost a loved one and you're able to start seeing where that energy is coming through in different ways and forms, it can be where a loved one starts looking like that person, and you go, wow, I know my other daughter started to look like Jenny after Jenny went, and for a while even started speaking like her. It was really very interesting. And you start seeing where things start happening, where that, because we're in a place of omniscience and omnipresence, that presence doesn't go, it just shows itself in new forms. And when you can start realigning as to where that energy, sometimes really subtly, is sitting, it's actually quite awe-inspiring in the end. So that's one of the things to start stepping into, is the knowledge that that person or people or animal that you've lost is somewhere. Their energy might not, it won't be in the form that you're used to seeing them in and experiencing them in, but they're there. So I'm just going to leave that food for thought with you there. And then it's being able to understand that you've always got choice. You don't have to say, okay, an example would be, again, with me, and I see this especially in parents who've lost children, where they go, all right, this is my lot. Because if I start saying I've moved on, then that would mean I didn't really love my loved one, that I'm fickle. And that's not the case, because when you can step into your power in honor and tribute to that lost loved one, knowing that there's more to it and there's a bigger picture to that loss, And that makes a big difference. And this is where I work with a lot of my clients, is for them to understand the hidden gift and the hidden meaning in having lost that loved one. That doesn't mean that the loss isn't there for the rest of their lives. I have that loss until the day I die and beyond. But it is being able to see and take a step back with some very, very important skills and techniques to take a step back and go, oh, I get the bigger picture and I understand the hidden meaning and gift in losing that loved one, that if they were still here with me, would not be present. So in losing a gift and having them, a new gift comes in not having them. And most of us are blocked, blinded, and distorted from being able to see that other gift because we're missing the gift we're so used to in having them in our presence and in our day-to-day lives and as part of our lives. So that's the first thing, or the first two things I wanted to share with you. The next thing is I'm going to actually share with you bits and pieces that helped me over a series of time in applying, long before I used the Epiphany Process, questions and answers, which help you to bring that loss into manageable, centered presence almost immediately. So instead of taking weeks and months and perhaps years and even a lifetime, or not taking any time to bring it into open-hearted presence, you can do it almost immediately. I've worked with people who've lost loved ones, and within days, they're getting that bigger picture and that sense of understanding that helps them to manage the loss. Doesn't take the loss away, it helps them to manage the loss in a shorter time frame than waiting forever and ever. And it certainly helped me in my journey. But before I started researching that, I began writing quite a lot of, well, in fact, I wrote 30 articles on how, and short articles. I wanted to make them short because when you're going through grieving, quite often your attention span through shock and loss and remorse makes it really difficult to listen and read and hear and have that sort of stimuli around you. So they're very short ones. And I would like to share them with you today. So the first one is about labeling grieving. And our quick fix society is prone to labeling grieving as being abnormal, as I've mentioned earlier, and sets about finding ways to quickly curtail it. And it's really not something that you can say, okay, they've got this, it's not good, we've got to get out of them and fix them because it's not serving them. And as much as that there is an element where it isn't serving them, it is serving them. And when you can see both sides, suddenly it's more manageable. And so again, when you give the grief the value it deserves, then the next step is to find out how to step out of feeling stuck in it and into finding how to rather work alongside it and transform it into our healing tool. So even back then, I was getting that, but I didn't know how to do that. That was the big thing. So how does grief operate? And this is another thing that's been a really big, interesting journey for me, because bless her cotton socks, the 5 stages of grieving are very helpful. But what I was finding when I was in those 5, looking at myself in those 5 stages, is because it's in a linear numerical order, I'd find, but I'm at number 5 and I've only just started. So is there something wrong with me? Or I'd be at number 1 and feel as though I was never getting out of number 1. And then suddenly I'd move to number 3 and then back to number 1 and down to 2. And I was going, what is this about? Because Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross for once managed to get the essence of grieving into 5 point forms, which was hugely helpful. But this is what I was finding was happening until in my studies, I began to understand that grief works in cycles, not in 5 stages. And there are uncountable cycles of grief according to our value systems. We all grieve differently. There are some essential happenings that happen in that, like the denial and the whole thing that is mentioned in the 5 stages. But what if I was to say that defining that grief operates in stages is kind of skewed? And so, if applying stages to work through a grief is not really applicable, then how does it? Well, it does. It happens. It comes in waves. I mean, hands up here of you who have either gone through a grieving process or are still going through a grieving process. And it takes a stimulus like a song, a smell, a sight, a happening that brings out a wave. Now, waves are cycles, brings out a wave of emotion or a wave of overwhelm that you just go, whoa, where did that come from, when you thought you were back on the straight and narrow? Because that's the deal with grieving. It comes in waves, and there are small waves and big waves, and sometimes you have, if you liken it to the sea, you have a neap tide and a spring tide, and when you understand that those waves are part of the process, it's easier to not fight them and to rather understand that they are part of learning the tools of how to embrace those waves and understand them and be empathetic to them and gain the tools to deal with them as they come up. Even now, I mean, it's 17 years since I lost my daughter. And still, I went through a whole load of her belongings last week, and those waves came up and I could feel them. There's nothing wrong with that. That isn't going, oh, I'm being overindulgent. Why should I still feel like this 17 years later? That's not what it is. You're always going to have those waves. It's how you handle them that's the most important thing. And then, of course, I talked about when we lose our loved ones, life operates from a place that's beyond bewildering. It feels surreal and nonsensical, with a very deep sense of feeling trapped within our bodies as though we're serving that life sentence, that life prison sentence, and that nobody else understands. And that we're trapped by default, that there's no way out, that we're destined to remain there for the rest of our lives through no choice of our own. You know, we didn't choose for our loved one to die. We've got no choice. And so one day during one of my darkest moments, I realized I really could no longer enjoy living a life of hell on earth. And that helped me to fully understand that I still had choice, because we tend to marginalize ourselves when we're grieving and say we have no choice but to feel like this. But there's always choice. I want to leave that with you today, if with nothing else. And that's when I began searching for ways to get myself out of my own internal dungeon. And whilst dealing with all those crippling, grieving emotions that surfaced from time to time, I began working with teachings that enabled me to find the hidden gifts within my loss. And I know that feels like an incredulous or a few statement for any of you who are dealing with deep grief and loss in whatever form. Could be that, I mean, our sense of purpose and life purpose, you've been working on your life purpose for forever, and the rug gets kept pulled under your feet. So your very self has died. That's a huge amount of grieving. And yet it's an amazing discovery once you start finding out what those hidden gifts are. And it enabled me to talk about my child with a deeper sense of love, acceptance, and grace. If you hear me talk about Jenny now, the way I refer to her is very different to the early days when I didn't have these skills and techniques. And I was able to terminate my sentence and free myself up to live once again. It's entirely possible, and I've helped many people do it. And of course, another good way is to reach out to others, because we tend to think that nobody understands. And let's get real. Some people don't. They try and fix you with what I call the band-aid cliches, oh, well, at least, those cliches, at least you didn't, or at least that didn't happen, or at least something, or, look at somebody else, they're in a worse situation than you are. Well, in that place, that doesn't work, because you can't even look at yourself, let alone anybody else. So it's about choosing the people to reach out to. And that's what I started to do. Was I chose my tribe after I lost Jenny. So the tribe that I could relate to in my loss, they would say things to me. I can't even imagine what it's like to have lost a child. I can't even imagine. But I'm here for you, to listen to you. I'm here to hold your hand if that's all you want. I'm here. I'm here to just be in a distance, knowing that I won't hear from you, but you can reach me. And because you can reach me, that's helping you to cope. If you want me near, if you want me at a distance, I'm here. And whatever it is that you want to express, I will listen. I'm here to listen. I won't try and fix you. I'm here to listen. So you start choosing your tribe that supports you and don't try and make you better, because normally a person that's trying to fix you and get better is because they're feeling uncomfortable and they want to get you better so they can feel comfortable. It has nothing to do with you. That's a big thing I learned at the end of it. And with that new tribe that I brought in, I felt lighter. And then life shifted for me into possible new possibilities. And then, of course, the next thing is I began to realize that the more I worked on myself, life felt very dark. And every now and then, a spark would feel like that old feeling, just a spark. And I'd go, oh, there's a spark of light. And I made the conscious decision to make sure that I looked for those sparks of light rather than just concentrate on the darkness. And then I started noticing that the more I looked for the sparks of light, the more I noticed they were always there, sparking. And I'd write them down. Okay, there was a spark of light. Somebody said something, and it made me kind of crack a tiny bit of a smile as I thought about it. Might have been an internal smile. That's a spark of light. So I started taking note of them, and then I noticed that the more I took notice of them, the more the sparks of light happened. And then I started noticing after a while that there was many sparks of light as there was the darkness. And then after a while, there was more sparks of light than the darkness. Especially, I lost my marriage as well. And I found that especially happening sooner in the loss of my marriage. So I started seeing the value of where things were working. And then in the end, I found that there were patches or bits and pieces of darkness every now and then, but that was mostly light. So I always say, start taking a conscious choice to put down those sparks of light. And one that's very, very close to my whole way of being is that I have noticed how much confusion reigns, and that we've been conditioned to believe that death is unacceptable. It's not part of the big plan of life. We get born, we live life, and we try and prolong death because it's a bad thing. It's got to be avoided at all costs. And yet it's as important an event as our birth and our life. It's the only thing that's guaranteed, by the way, after we're conceived. The moment that seed hits the ovum and goes in, you're going to die. It's guaranteed. It's not like maybe I can make it never happen. And death's been given a bad name, and it's been made out to be avoided at all costs. And this mindset, it makes it challenging, if not near to impossible, to accept the loss of a loved one. So when you start understanding that there are different cycles, 70 years ago, people were dying in their 50s and everybody was saying they were old. Now people die at that age and they're young. So do we go back to the people who died 70 years ago and say posthumously, you died too young? Well, did they or didn't they? Lifespans change. It's all part of those cycles. And when we get attached to the label of when we should or shouldn't die, there's a lot of fear that gets attached to trying and avoiding dying or avoiding having other people around us die. Please don't get me wrong, there's still a process of losing that one, even though it's part of the cycle of life. And of course, the other thing was learning the value of exercising and creativity. For me, especially creativity, although I am a ballet dancer and I have done a lot of exercising through my lifetime, definitely creativity. And that's why we have World Jenny's Day. For those of you who don't know about it, go to worldjennysday.com, because there we use creativity through dealing and handling and embracing depression and suicidal feelings. And it's the same with grief. When you can start using creativity, because that's what we do on World Jenny's Day every 10th of October. When you're using creativity to shift conversations around loss and grief and to normalize it, instead of saying a person's grieving and we need to bring them back to normal, then suddenly they start being able to create through their creativity a new version of themselves post having had that great loss. And of course, exercise and creativity, it's a no-brainer. Endorphins released from exercising are helpful in shifting one's outlook and mood. So it's something that I really got myself into from early on in losing Joan, was walking every day to begin with. And some days, I promise you, it was like 20 steps and I walked back in the house. But I knew it was 20 steps more than not doing it. Then 50 steps, then and I increased it as much as I could. And I used to invite those people who endorsed me and loved me and listened to me and empathized and helped me to move through. They would often join me as well. So yeah, and another thing that's very, very interesting, if you've lost a loved one, so often we're in such shock in having lost a loved one that everybody else is organizing everything. I know that a lot of what I went through was partially organized that way. And so often I say to people, if you have lost a loved one and the funeral's over, and you went, but that funeral wasn't anything like they wanted or we wanted or they and we wanted, why not have another memorial service or a service in honor of them? That I've seen that happen, and it's helped. And we did create growth in the end. We had a service that I knew wasn't anything like Jenny would relate to, but was needed by some members of the family. And then we had a celebration of Jenny's life where we laughed and talked about all her anecdotes and funny sayings as well. So that in a nutshell gives you some initial baby steps. But if you'd like to go more powerfully into dealing with your grief, so that you can, because those take a long time to employ and implement, and I still employ them to this day whenever I'm challenged, and they're hugely helpful. But if you would like to be able to learn how to reform that internal conversation inside yourself that goes with grieving, those I should have, I could have, I ought to have, and if only, those are the ones that can stick you into years and years of grief. And if you'd like to know how to reform those conversations so those regrets are brought into manageability and new conversations start internally, a new form of communicating about that loss, which opens your heart. If you'd like to know more about that, I would love to hear from you, because it's entirely possible to do. And I want to thank you for your attention and interest today. and to say, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is USA Global TV and Radio, and you can find all of our Talking Heads episodes under the playlist titled Talking Heads 2022. And again, please do reach out to me if I may be of service. I've been able to help thousands of people internationally online for 15, 16 years now on how to bring those regrets into a place of manageability and to live a life filled with purpose because of their loss. I look forward to speaking to you again in the future, in future shows, as I wish you lots of inspiring times this week and send you equally amount of lots of love.